Hi, and thank you for listening to our talk about reuse and how to make it happen. I'm Isabel, Head of Strategy at DXW.
And I'm James, Technical Principal at DXW.
Over the next 20 minutes, we'll discuss the reuse of technology in the public sector. We've included our email addresses on the final slide in case you'd like to get in touch with us and talk about this topic more. We're aware that reuse occurs in other settings too, and we expect what we may say may have a broader relevance or application. We both work at DXW, and DXW is an employee-owned digital agency that works exclusively with the public and charity sector. We design, build, and run services for the public good with agile multidisciplinary teams. We're now at over 80 full-time staff and still growing, and we work with a wide network of associates as well. We all have one thing in common. We want to create better public services, and we think our employee ownership and culture means we can prioritise our clients and their users. And we've been doing this work since 2008 and have worked with many clients on some of Britain's most critical digital infrastructure. We've kept the NHS England website up to date and available during a pandemic, and we've built new services such as a service with Hackney Council to better manage repairs for their social housing, and a national service to post teaching jobs with the Department for Education, and many more services too. I've been working at DXW for over 4 years, and I currently run our small but lively strategy team. This strategy team helps public good organisations decide what to do and how to do it. Our team doesn't build services, but we do help and enable organisations to do this themselves. Prior to DXW, I've worked in agencies, the charity sector, central government as a civil servant, spending most of my time in the government digital service, and before this, local government, where I started my career. All the environments I've worked in have focused on delivery and transformation of public services, from either a policy perspective, a technology perspective, or sometimes both.
And I'm James, a relatively new employee at DXW. My background is in software development, but in my new role as technical principal, I take a wider consulting role on how technology interacts with strategy, delivery, and policy. I started my career in the startup world, but I've been working in the public sector's digital world for over a decade, including as a tech lead at Government Digital Service and as Deputy Head of Software Development at the Ministry of Justice, where I was one of the founding members of the digital team, growing it from 4 to 150 people. So today we'd like to talk about the reuse and sharing of technology in the public sector. The benefits are potentially huge, but successes have been much rarer than you'd expect. We'd like to explore why that might be and what we can do to improve the situation. We don't have all the answers, but we've had many insights from our experiences, as I'm sure many of you have. And we'd like to start a conversation with others who want to find the right opportunities and develop the governance and approaches needed to make this work. In principle, reuse is a no-brainer. Code has this amazing quality about it, in that code has a near zero marginal cost. To give a very simplified example of what that means, when the government buys 2 million pens, it will cost them about twice as much as 1 million pens. But 2 million visits to the gov.uk website only cost a fraction more than the first million visits. This is because we can use code again and again and again. This creates the opportunity to scale good ideas across the huge estate of the public sector. Given this, it's obviously incredibly frustrating for everyone when we see, for example, neighbouring local councils doing very similar things to each other, but not sharing the technology that they have already built or failing to work together to build something together in the first place. But first, what does it mean to share technology? It can mean a very wide spectrum of things, and to demonstrate this, I'd like to give 3 successful examples from just within the gov.uk ecosystem that are quite different in how they work to each other. The first is gov.uk Notify. It allows anyone across government to send SMS and emails from their service. It currently supports 4,000 services across the public sector, and they recently sent their 3 billionth message. In this case, what is being shared is a hosted bit of shared infrastructure. It's managed by a central authority, And when we say sharing, we mean something that's a lot closer to a more traditional customer-centric model. The second example is the gov.uk front-end toolkit, which enables software teams to very quickly make their service look and feel like a gov.uk service. This keeps a consistent experience across government, whilst also sharing the hundreds of hours of user research and accessibility testing that has gone into making gov.uk. In this case, it's an open source library of code that's being shared and is primarily managed by the gov.uk team. But to use it, you copy the code into your own project. Once it's there, you can use it as it is or edit it to fit your needs. You can request to contribute those edits back into the main project, or you might alternatively create your own fork of the project if you realize that you have specific needs that aren't going to be met by the original team. The third example is not actually sharing any code, but putting in the extra work to really explain what decisions you have made along the process, extracting those out into patterns in a way that other projects might find useful. An example of this is the gov.uk design system. It doesn't really specify or provide any particular technologies, but explains the outcome of the work you should aim for. In this case, as we can see on the screen now, is the pattern for how to ask users for their gender or sex. To recap, that's three very different examples of sharing technology: a centralized managed service, an open source project, and the sharing of patterns. There are so many other possible configurations and ways to share and work together on a technology. It's worth considering where you are and what's the best model for you. All three of these examples are examples of working in the open and putting in the extra work to make them reusable. However, I think these two concepts get confused too often. And the justification for working in the open is often that it can be reused in the future. While that's not untrue, that working in the open is a prerequisite for reusability, there are plenty of reasons to work in the open that aren't reuse, and we shouldn't forget them. The first of these is transparency. As public servants, we should always be as transparent as possible with the public, and this should include the code that we write as well. So we can see this in action here. This is a public change request that was made a few days ago on gov.uk. I can see exactly what changed and when it happened. Granted that this feature of adding some page titles to an admin interface isn't the most exciting or controversial feature, but that's not a reason to not make it in the open. The second is that there are some small but not insignificant efficiency gains by working in the open. We don't have to spend time building access controls, and new staff don't have to wait a few hours while their password is reset for them to be granted access. No sign-on is much better than single sign-on. Many tools and services are much cheaper if they don't have to consider security or integrate into the authentication process. For example, here is the homepage of Travis CI, an industry standard development tool. They commit on their homepage to always provide their service for free if your code is in the open. Additionally, while there absolutely is a saving in the actual cost of any contract that would have to be made otherwise, I often find that the bigger and often forgotten saving here is the fact that developers don't have to wait for a purchase order to be raised or a department credit card to be found, and they can just start using it immediately. A third advantage that is counterintuitive to many is that working in the open leads to more secure services. In the information security industry, it is known that not working in the open can encourage a practice called security through obscurity, something strongly discouraged by the National Cybersecurity Centre. So an example that covers all three of the previous points so far is this pull request that has been automatically generated by a free tool that detected one of the project's technical dependencies is out of date and therefore might be introducing some security vulnerabilities. So we can see that by working in the open, it's become a lot easier to enable more eyes to ensure that everything is secure and to a high quality. And the final point is that even if the code itself isn't copied wholesale, by working in the open, then it is possible for other teams to look at what you're doing and to learn from it. You might be talking to another team in a meeting, and you can easily send them a link to a chunk of work that you've been working on and you think is relevant to them. And this is where we start getting very close to the reusability discussion, but I want to make that point again. Working in the open does not automatically mean reusable code. There is nearly always additional work to be done to make your work easily reusable by others. This does not mean you shouldn't work in the open, but also your reason for working in the open should not depend on your work being reusable. I'm going to hand back to Isabel to discuss what some of the extra work is and why it's harder than just working in the open.
Thanks, James. So now we understand what reuse is. Why is it often the case that reuse of technology is difficult to achieve? Based on our experiences, we've identified some of the reasons why we think reuse can be difficult. And one reason is complexity. And complexity breaks down into a number of elements. Complexity is present when looking across multiple organizations that seek to reuse the same technology. And we think this is partly down to the fact that organizations don't necessarily start from the same place, despite seeing the value in using something similar. But why does this make things complex? We suggest the starting place is unique to each organization. For example, with regards to their technology ecosystem, their organizational or team structures. But how far can this natural diversity between organizations be factored in when creating one product or service to be reused multiple times? And how do you overcome the challenge of each organization needing something slightly different and when reusing technology? Without generating a lot of work and perhaps even ending up with something that doesn't quite look like reuse. We think this highlights the complexity of reuse. Another element of complexity regards the people involved. If reuse means more organizations, this means more stakeholders and in turn may lead to complexity. Depending on what you're reusing and who is reusing it, this may not be a problem. For example, reusing something within an organization may be potentially less of a complex stakeholder landscape than reusing technology across multiple organizations. And this could be because stakeholders want different things at different times, but for good reasons, as stakeholders will reflect the needs of their own organizations and hopefully the needs of the people that may end up using the technology you've decided to reuse. We do expect that stakeholders reusing the same technology will have some of the same needs, but it's likely there will be a greater number of needs to consider, and getting the right balance may take some time. Another area of complexity regards the scope. With more people involved, it's likely the scope could be larger. Refining the scope into a manageable size that meets the expectations of all involved may take some determination. And a mechanism for keeping the scope contained once it has been agreed is another important thing to do. If your scope continues to grow, your product will end up having many customizations, which may make it harder to use and ultimately less compelling to potential users. In addition to complexity, another reason we think reuse is difficult regards the investment needed. An investment is needed for the technology to become reusable. This is investment of time, money, people, and energy, and all of which may be needed upfront before the technology has even been reused. We suggest alongside investment, trust is also needed. We mean trust in an idea, a concept, and the potential of a given piece of technology. You need to invest in the technology itself, and this means the code. Code is not a capital expense. It needs maintaining and iterating, and this requires a team of people, which is often forgotten or deprioritized. Timing is another aspect that makes reuse difficult. Timing is something that an organization may have less control over than they'd hope. A prime example is procurement timelines, and it may be difficult to plan the decommissioning of technology in order to replace it with something you plan to reuse. Trying to align timing between organizations can be especially hard. So to recap, the reasons why we think reuse can be difficult include the complexity that's involved, the possibility of a wider scope, the need for investment, and the importance of timing. but perhaps reuse doesn't need to be this difficult. And there might be things that you can consider in order to help reuse to happen more often. Firstly, you really need to be reusing the right technology to help align stakeholders' needs and to keep scope in check. What you reuse is essential. The audience of the technology you plan to reuse need it and perhaps also want it. What you reuse needs to be compelling, especially when entering an existing, established or competitive space.
This is not to say that large services can't be shared, but as we mentioned earlier about scope, it is a lot easier to share something with clear, defined edges.
Governance is an important area to consider. We suggest the right governance structure could enable you to engage an audience in reusing technology and contribute to the development of the technology once it's been reused. Ideally, you'll have a shared governance structure between the organizations involved. It would be helpful for this governance structure to be low maintenance and lightweight, whilst providing the assurances that organizations need in order to feel confident. We feel like there's lots of potential for innovation in this space. And related to governance is commitment, and commitment needs to be genuine and long-lasting. And this point leads to the next, which regards the team.
Code is rarely useful by itself. It needs a team of people behind it to maintain and continuously improve what it does. Therefore, it's important to remember that you're not just sharing the code in order for it to be reused, you're sharing the whole multidisciplinary team and the product backlog that they are working against. All stakeholders should be active participants in the agile development process, which will include having representatives in the planning session, in the retrospectives, and the stand-ups in the morning.
So to recap, we've told you about the things we think might make reuse easier to achieve. The first was about reusing the right technology, and the second, reusing something smaller than perhaps something larger in size. Governance and commitment also helpful, and finally the team, and ideally a shared team. So we've told you about what reuse is, and we've illustrated this by sharing examples. We've shared our thoughts on why reuse is difficult and the things you might want to think about in order to make it easier. If you'd like to stay in touch and talk to us about this topic we're really interested in, please do. Our email addresses are on this slide. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much.